One thing that we often hear get talked about in sports media circuits is how can you compare quarterbacks from different eras, or just players in general from different eras, but we don't often dive deeper into that. And I thought it could be an interesting video to actually break down the different eras of football, rule changes, and just things in general that happened that caused passing to go up and other things to happen. So I figured this could be an interesting idea for a video. I'm going to break down in this one what happened throughout the course of history to get football from being a game that was essentially running the ball every play to what it is today. While I will discuss a lot of the history of previous games, I'm also going to get into recent football as well and talk about why even just 20 years ago, it was really a completely different game than what it is today. But it was very much a different game 100 years ago, so let's get into it. Football kind of started in 1969. Well, I think there are some disagreements as to what year it actually started. This is really the year that we have a first official record of a football game being played, but it was incredibly different. And in fact, many different, usually was colleges at the time, many different colleges that played football would have their own set of rules. In fact, a committee got together in 1873 to create a set of rules, and Harvard just outright refused to agree to those rules and played by their own rules instead. A couple of fun facts from this era. First, why is it called football? A lot of people say you barely use your foot. Why is it called football? It actually has nothing to do with the fact that your foot touches the ball. It's because games used to be separated into games that were played on horseback and games that were played on foot back then, so it was called football. One more fun fact, a lot of people have wondered, why is it called quarterback, halfback, and fullback? What's the logic there? It actually just stems from back in the day, the tailback, a different position, was the person who usually had the ball. The quarterback stood a quarter back to where the tailback is. The halfback stood halfway back to where the tailback is. And the fullback stood right next to the tailback, or fully back to where the tailback is. But let's move ahead to 1920. I mostly talk about the NFL here, so let's talk NFL, as this is when it technically started. It wasn't called the NFL until a couple years later, but in Canton, Ohio, this league that we now know as the NFL would come to be. At this point, the forward pass was already a thing, but it was heavily restricted, and we'll get into a lot of the restrictions that were lifted as we go throughout this video. This chart, which is what I'm going to use a pretty decent amount throughout this video, as it does a pretty good job of showing just point totals per era. So the two numbers you're looking at, this is just the average points by the winning team and average points by the losing team. This was just the best chart I could find. That I would have done it just by average team, but this chart essentially does the same effect. You see, definitely an uptick that happened early on. But specifically right there, you saw a first major swing. What happened in 1932? Well, it's actually a pretty interesting story. So in 1932, there was a game that would decide the championship game between the Bears and the Spartans. This was it wasn't an actual championship game. It was just a game that would decide the championship. It just kind of worked out that way. Back then, there was no championship game, but a player threw a jump pass for a go-ahead touchdown, and it shouldn't have counted because the player was not 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Back then, it wasn't just you had to be behind the line of scrimmage, you had to be 5 yards behind the line of scrimmage. Despite this, the refs, the refs have been missing calls even from the beginning of the NFL. They counted it regardless, and fans actually liked the play. It was an exciting game. It was an exciting play. And then a rules committee was committed because of the controversial call. So a rules committee has been created now, and they're thinking about this and saying, well, wait a second, why do we want to get rid of these exciting plays? Let's maybe make the exciting plays happen more. So that's what they did. Forward passes now were legal from anywhere behind the line of scrimmage. Goalposts were moved forward, actually, to the goal line. A lot of people know that goalposts used to be at the goal line on the field of play, but a lot of people don't realize that it actually started out of the back of the end zone like it is today. They moved it forward to try and create more field goals. Also, hash marks were created to try and give the offense more space. It used to be that once you went out of bounds, you kind of just barely got back inbounds. They allowed you to get more inbounds to try and create more offense. And also, the first championship game was created because it was such a success, the 1932 game that decided the championship. And while you see on the chart, it's a gradual increase, year after year, that's because there were gradual rules to help out offenses. So in 1934, there used to be penalties for multiple incomplete passes on the same drive. This is the year that changed. So it used to be a penalty if you throw multiple incomplete passes on the same drive. This year, no longer a penalty. You can throw as many incomplete passes as you would like. In 1938, roughing the passer was adjusted because they had some quarterbacks that were playing well and becoming stars, like Sammy Baugh and Sid Luckman. They wanted to help protect those guys, so the roughing the passer penalties helped to do that. There were also some other weird regulations involving the forward pass that were lifted. So, for one thing, incomplete passes in the end zone used to be turnovers. If you threw an incomplete pass past the goal line, then it used to be that the other team just got the ball at the 20-yard line. They got rid of that rule. And also, incomplete passes when you were behind the goal line used to be ruled a safety. They got rid of that rule as well, and that was in 1945. Then it just became a regular incomplete pass. But now let's look at that section right there. We're talking about 1949. What happened in 1949? Well, for one thing, everyone knows about at least a lot of people know about the merger with the AFL that the NFL had. But a lot of people don't realize that was not the first time they merged with a league. They also merged with the AAFC in 1949. And once they did that, there was also another rule change that is one of the most significant rule changes the NFL has ever had. That was the unlimited substitutions rule change. Basically, prior to that, there were restrictions on how often you could come out of the game. So you could, if you exited the game, you weren't allowed to come back into the game until another quarter had passed, until the next quarter. And once you got taken out of the game twice, you were out of the game, period. There were heavy restrictions on that. And to be clear, that doesn't mean on offense you could come out of the game, but you just had to stay on. It meant offense, defense, special teams, you had to stay on. So every player played offense, defense, and special teams back then. But in 1949, that changed. You were allowed to play, have defensive specialists. You were allowed to have offensive specialists and specialists. And because of this, you actually saw points per game go down a little bit. The quarterbacks of this era were guys like Johnny Unitas, Bart Starr, and Otto Graham. Otto Graham started as a two-way player era before switching over. So a lot of these guys still had some experience at other positions, just because that's what had been the case. But this is when you start to see specialists, what we kind of know today. For the next section, some interesting stuff happens here. So for one thing, the greatest game ever, that's what they called it, back in 1958 was played. In 1959, the AFL started. Due to the rising popularity of football, the AFL started and was getting very popular to the point where they merged with the NFL in 1967, although the official merger was a couple years later. That's when the Super Bowl started in 67, when, of course, the Packers won the first two, and then the Jets won the third one. So that line right there, that is when the merger happened, and you see another downswing of point totals. You might be thinking, oh, I bet I know what happened there. That's because it was the merger, right? That makes sense. Actually, not so much. One of the real reasons why point totals went down was because the hash marks were moved again. They got closer, making rushing just a lot easier. And so, in theory, you would think, okay, well, that's helping the offense, right? Well, when you're running the ball a lot more, there's less possessions, more times coming off the clock, and there's not the explosive plays downfield. So because of that, points totals went down. However, in 1977, and this might be really when some people wake up in this video and find it more interesting, the Mel Blount rule took effect. And there actually was a lesser known rule called the Isaac Curtis rule in 1974 that also helped with this. But 77, the Mel Blount rule, essentially Mel Blount, player for the Steelers, was so good at just jamming players at the line. And I mean, if you see footage of him, he looks like he should be a defensive end, not a cornerback. He's a huge guy. Essentially, it was just impossible for receivers to get open. And what they decided to do was just made it a lot more difficult for a corner to physically play against a wide receiver. Because of this, you do see an upswing in points, but what you really see is an upswing in passing yards. To look at this chart right here, I mean, I don't even have to show you where the Mel Blount rule is. I will anyway. That is when the Mel Blount rule was introduced. You see the massive downswing in yardage and passing yardage per game. It goes way up after that. So definitely that rule made passing a lot easier, and this is what opened the door for guys like Dan Marino, Joe Montana, John Elway, who played their whole career after the Mel Blount rule. I don't think it's entirely a coincidence that basically everyone that gets put in the GOAT conversation played after 1977. And I think part of it too is that's just one, people that are still talking about football and still in TV and stuff. Remember these guys too. That's obviously a factor, but still. Part of me does wonder if someone like Roger Staubach, who played half his career before this rule, as did someone like Terry Bradshaw, would they be remembered a little differently if they had the numbers that were better because they played prior to the rule change? I don't know. Also over there, you see another massive jump. So there are some things I'm glossing over. Like, for example, in 1994, 2-point attempts were introduced. And in fact, the first ever successful 2-point attempt in football was when Bill Belichick's Cleveland Browns ran an extra point, ran a fake for an extra point and got the 2-point conversion because, of course, Belichick had the first one of those. But in 2004, this is an interesting note as well. This is when illegal contact was enforced more. It was a rule already in the books, but it really got enforced more and was really, I think, kind of essentially more like what the NFL we know today is. Famously, the Colts struggled to beat the Patriots. Famously, Jim Irsay sat on the competition committee, as Bill Burr always likes to talk about, to help get this rule adjusted to where it helped the Indianapolis Colts. And while the Patriots did win the Super Bowl right after, the Colts were able to win a Super Bowl a couple years later with it. And this created the whole passing boom in the 2000s with Peyton Manning, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, of course, was still benefiting from this in terms of his stats. This is why you see the big upswing. You also see a little bit of a downswing. No real rule change there. What kind of happened there is you see right there in 2020, that was the 2020 Super Bowl with Patrick Mahomes struggling against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Todd Bowles played 2 safety deep coverages all game. A lot of people saw that and said, that's a good idea. We should try that. And you essentially saw just every team doing whatever they can to take away the passing because passing had gotten so good that teams weren't even focused on stopping the run anymore. This is why, there's the whole don't draft running backs thing that has started. It's in this era. And that's really kind of where we are today, I would say. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning. I'm talking about the major things, but there have been a lot of minor things. And in fact, all throughout history, the biggest rule changes that have happened have been little things to make playing defense harder and make playing offense easier. And again, it's worth mentioning, making something illegal doesn't just help the offense in terms of those being penalties. What it also does, it just means that the defenders can't do those things anymore, right? So when illegal contact is enforced more and more difficult for corners to defend, now they have to defend less and they're giving up more separation, which is what has created this passing boom, and that is kind of the history of football as of right now. So yeah, I thought this would be an interesting video, a little brief history lesson, and feel free, again, there's tons of things I missed, so feel free to bring up more things that I did miss in the comments below, because at the end of the day, you can only get to so much detail about this stuff. But yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Always love hearing from you. And of course, as always, thanks for watching.